5 minutes. That's all it took for my husband to try to erase me from my own life. I remember the exact way David smiled when he said it. Calm, certain, like he had already won before the judge even opened the case file. I'll take everything. Not half. Not what was fair. Everything. The house. The accounts. Even the inheritance my parents left me, the one thing I had that was never his to touch. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke. My attorney went still beside me. Just for a second. Like she needed to recalculate everything she thought she knew about this case. And then I saw her, Lauren, sitting right behind him, watching me. That's when I realized this wasn't just a divorce. It was a setup. The judge reached for his pen, ready to move forward, ready to let David continue building his version of the story. But I had already heard enough. I picked up the envelope I had been holding the entire time. My fingers steady even though my heart wasn't. Your Honor, I said, my voice calm, controlled. Before you decide anything, you might want to look at this. For the first time that morning, David stopped smiling. And for the first time in years, I knew something he didn't. The courtroom in downtown Los Angeles always felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the polished wood, the echo of footsteps, or the way people sat there waiting to have their lives dissected in front of strangers. Or maybe it was just what happens when truth and lies are forced into the same space. I stood at the table, my posture straight, my hands resting lightly against the surface. If anyone looked at me from the outside, they would have seen a composed woman, a journalist, 37, educated, rational. What they wouldn't see was how carefully that composure had been built. Across from me, David leaned back in his chair like this was just another meeting he controlled. His suit was perfectly tailored, his watch catching the light every time he moved his wrist. Everything about him was deliberate. He didn't even look at me when he spoke to his lawyer. He didn't need to. In his mind, I was already behind him. I want full control of all shared assets, he said, loud enough for the room to hear, including anything tied to her inheritance. It was all managed through our marriage. Managed, that was his word. Not shared, not earned. Managed. Like I had been something he handled, not someone who had built a life alongside him. I felt the familiar pressure rise in my chest. The same one I used to mistake for fear. But it wasn't fear anymore. Not really. It was recognition. Because this wasn't new. This was just the first time he was saying it out loud in a room full of people who couldn't look away. The judge glanced down at the documents in front of him, flipping through pages with quiet efficiency. My lawyer shifted beside me, leaning slightly closer. This is aggressive, she whispered under her breath. We expected him to push. But this, I know, I said quietly, not taking my eyes off David. She paused, studying my face. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about money. Not entirely. This was about control. It always had been. I let my gaze drift past him. Just for a moment. That's when I saw Lauren again, sitting in the second row. Her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral. If someone didn't know better, they might have thought she was just another observer. Maybe a colleague, maybe a curious outsider. But I knew better. I knew the way she tilted her head when she was studying something. The way her eyes narrowed just slightly when she thought she understood the outcome of a situation. She wasn't surprised by anything David was saying, which meant she had heard it all before. A slow, quiet realization settled into place. This had been planned. Not just the divorce. Not just the asset claims. All of it. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the room's attention back to the front. Mr. Carter, he said evenly, your request is noted. However, we will need to review. David didn't wait. With respect. Your Honor, everything is already documented. There's no ambiguity here. Confidence. Precision. Pressure. He was pushing the pace, trying to move things forward before anything could slow him down. before anything could challenge him. My lawyer straightened. Your Honor, we strongly object to... I touched her arm lightly. Wait, I said. She turned to me. Confused? Ashley, we can't let him... I know, I repeated, softer this time. And then I reached for the envelope. It was plain. No markings. No indication of what was inside. Just paper. But it felt heavier than anything else in that room. I had carried it in with me that morning, knowing there would be a moment when everything depended on whether I used it or didn't. This was that moment. I stepped forward slightly, just enough for the judge to notice the movement. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, cutting cleanly through the tension in the room. Before we proceed any further, I'd like you to review something. The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. The judge looked up, his expression unreadable. What is it? Ms. Carter. I walked the few steps toward the bench, each one measured, deliberate. From the corner of my eye, I saw David finally turn his head toward me. Not fully. Just enough. Just enough to realize I was moving. Just enough to feel the first flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. I placed the envelope on the edge of the bench. It's evidence. I said simply, for a second. No one moved. Then the judge reached for it. Behind me, I could feel the entire room holding its breath. And as I stepped back into place, I allowed myself one small, quiet thought. He thought he was walking into a victory. He had no idea he had already walked into the truth. There was a time when that smile meant something completely different to me. Standing in that courtroom, watching David lean back like he owned the outcome, I couldn't help but remember how easily I used to believe in him. How effortlessly he had convinced me that what we had was solid, unbreakable. We were the couple people pointed to at dinner parties. The ambitious entrepreneur and the investigative journalist. Power and intellect, side by side. Or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. In the beginning, David had a way of making everything feel simpler. He handled things. That was the word he liked to use. Finances, planning, logistics, anything that could become overwhelming. He would step in and take control. You've got enough on your plate, he would say, brushing it off with a charming smile. Let me deal with the rest. And I let him. At the time, it felt like support, like partnership. Looking back, it was the first step. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about control. It doesn't arrive as a demand. It settles in quietly, disguised as care. Our joint account slowly shifted. At first, it was small things. He suggested consolidating funds for efficiency. Then he recommended moving certain assets under his management because he had better connections. I didn't question it. Why would I? I was working long hours, chasing leads, writing stories that barely left me time to breathe. It made sense to trust him with the things I didn't have time to oversee. Until one day, I tried to access one of our accounts, and couldn't. I remember staring at my screen, thinking it had to be a mistake. A password error. A glitch. Something simple. When I asked him about it that night, he didn't hesitate. Oh, I moved that, he said casually. Like he was talking about rearranging furniture. It's under a different structure now. Tax reasons. I frowned. Why didn't you tell me? He gave me that look, the one that made me feel like I was overreacting. I didn't think it was a big deal. Ashley, you trust me, don't you? It wasn't the question that bothered me. It was the way it made the answer feel like a test. So I nodded. And that was enough. After that, things became easier for him. Harder for me. The more he handled, the less access I had, the less I knew, and the more I relied on him to explain my own life back to me. He never called it control. He called it responsibility. At the same time, something else began to shift. Not all at once, but slowly enough that I almost missed it. The people around me started to disappear. Not physically. Not immediately. But conversations changed. Invitations stopped coming. Colleagues I used to meet for coffee suddenly seemed distant. Those people aren't really your friends, David would say, his tone calm. Reasonable. They're using you. You should be careful who you trust. At first, I defended them. Then I started noticing small things. A canceled lunch here. A delayed reply there. And without realizing it, I began pulling away, because it was easier than questioning why everything felt different. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already alone in ways I couldn't explain. And that's when Lauren appeared. She came into my life like she had always belonged there. Another journalist. Younger, sharp, eager to learn. She admired my work, asked thoughtful questions, listened in a way that felt rare. It was refreshing. After months of feeling isolated, she felt like a connection I hadn't lost. We met for coffee, talked about stories, shared frustrations about deadlines and editors. She laughed easily, leaned in when I spoke, made me feel heard again. I trusted her, more than I should have. Looking back, the signs were there, small things that didn't quite fit. The way she asked about my schedule, about David, about how we handled finances, of all things. At the time, I thought she was just curious, trying to understand how things worked. Now I know she was gathering information. But the first real crack didn't come from her. It came from him. Late nights became later. His phone, once left carelessly on the table, was now always within reach. Screen turned down. Notifications silenced. I didn't confront him. Not right away. Instead, I watched. I remember one night in particular, he was in the kitchen. His back turned. His voice low as he spoke into his phone. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone. Careful, controlled, different. When he walked back into the living room, he didn't realize I had seen the screen light up before he locked it. Just a name. Lauren. It didn't make sense at first. My mind tried to reject it, to find another explanation. A professional connection. A shared contact. Something innocent. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed there, quiet but persistent. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't ignore it. I started paying attention, not reacting, not accusing, observing, because something wasn't right. And whatever it was bigger than I had allowed myself to believe. A few days later, I tried to access another account, another wall, another explanation. Another version of reality that didn't quite match what I was seeing. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, internal realization. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I knew enough. Enough to understand that whatever was happening behind the scenes, it wasn't accidental. And it definitely wasn't harmless. By the time I stopped asking questions, David thought he had already won. He thought I was still the same woman who trusted his answers. What he didn't realize was that I had already stopped believing him. And once that happened, I stopped being his wife and started paying attention like it was a story that needed to be uncovered. Suspicion wasn't enough. That was the first thing I told myself after I saw Lauren's name on his phone and realized I couldn't explain it away anymore. I had spent too long second-guessing my instincts. Too long accepting his version of reality because it was easier than questioning it. But now I needed proof. Because David wasn't the kind of man you confronted without it. He was too composed, too practiced at turning things around, making you doubt what you had just seen with your own eyes. If I was going to survive this, I needed the truth, not pieces of it, not feelings, facts. So I went back to the only thing I had always trusted, my work. I pulled out my old laptop one night after he went to bed. It still had the folders from past investigations, notes organized in ways only I understood, half-finished outlines of stories I never got to publish. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I hadn't used this part of myself in a long time, but it was still there, waiting. I opened a new file and started writing everything down. Dates. Conversations. Small details I had ignored at the time but now felt important. Patterns don't appear all at once. You build them, piece by piece. And once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. The first place I looked was where David had told me not to worry. Money. I still had access to a few shared statements. Older records he hadn't thought to restrict. At first glance, everything looked normal. Regular transfers, business expenses, investments. But I wasn't looking for obvious mistakes. I was looking for inconsistencies. It started small. A transfer that didn't match the timeline he had given me. A payment to an entity I didn't recognize. A pattern of withdrawals that repeated just enough to stand out if you were paying attention. I leaned closer to the screen, scrolling slowly, letting the numbers tell their story. This wasn't just hiding money, I whispered to myself. This was structure. Careful. Intentional. The kind of structure you build when you don't want to get caught. I tried to access newer accounts. The ones he had moved everything into. Locked. Password protected. Multi-layer authentication. Systems designed to keep me out. Not just out, separated. That's when it hit me. This hadn't started recently. This had been building for a long time. He wasn't reacting to a failing marriage. He was preparing for something. And I had been living inside that preparation without even realizing it. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing through everything I had overlooked. Every conversation, every don't worry about it, every moment I had chosen trust over doubt. And suddenly, it all felt coordinated. My chest tightened. But I forced myself to stay focused. Emotion wouldn't help me now. Only information would. I went back to the records and started cross-referencing what I could find. Business filings, public documents, names of companies linked to transactions that didn't make sense. Shells. That was the word that kept coming to mind. Empty structures used to move things quietly. The deeper I looked, the more connections started to form, and then I saw her name again. Not directly. Not spelled out in a way that would be obvious to anyone else. But enough. An email thread buried in a folder he thought I couldn't access. Fragments of communication that slipped through whatever system he had built. Lauren wasn't just part of his life. She was part of this. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as I opened the file. My heart beating harder now, not from fear, but from clarity. Messages. Coordinated. Precise. Not emotional. Strategic. They weren't talking like people in a relationship. They were talking like people executing a plan. I felt something inside me settle into place. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was operational. She wasn't replacing me, I said quietly. She was helping him. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the screen, letting the weight of that realization sink in. Because once you understand the scale of something, you can't go back to seeing it as small. I kept digging, not recklessly, carefully, methodically. I copied what I could, took notes, built timelines. Every piece mattered. Every detail was part of something bigger. And then, one night, something shifted. I noticed it before I could explain it. The same car, parked across the street. At first, I thought it was coincidence. A neighbor, someone visiting. But then I saw it again the next day. And the day after that, different angles. Same car. My phone started acting strangely too. Messages loading slower. Notifications appearing and disappearing. I tested it. Changed my route home. Took a longer way. Turned twice where I normally wouldn't. The car followed. Not aggressively. Just enough. I'm not the only one watching, I whispered to myself. A chill ran down my spine. But I didn't stop. If anything, it confirmed what I already knew. I was getting close. Too close for his comfort. That night, I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat back down in front of my laptop. If he thought fear would stop me, he didn't understand me at all. Because this wasn't just about catching him anymore. This was about understanding what he had built. And why. Hours later, I found it A transaction buried under layers of transfers, routed through multiple entities before landing in an account that didn't officially exist under his name. But it connected dates, amounts, timing. All of it lined up with key moments in our marriage. This wasn't random. It was preparation. Preparation for something that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe something that was already in motion. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady now. "This is it," I said under my breath. The first piece of real evidence. Not suspicion. Not theory. Proof. But even as I saved the file, backing it up in multiple places, I knew something else. This wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning. Because the deeper I went, the more it became clear. I wasn't uncovering a divorce plan. I was uncovering a setup. And I had no idea yet just how far it went. The moment I understood his plan, I knew I couldn't stop him. I had to let him continue. That was the part no one ever tells you about uncovering the truth. Knowing something isn't enough. Timing is everything. If I confronted David too early, he would adapt. He would erase whatever I had found, rebuild the narrative, and make me look unstable in the process. He was too good at that. So I did the only thing I could. I went quiet. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just quieter than before. I stopped asking questions. Stopped challenging his explanations. Stopped reacting when things didn't add up. And almost immediately, something changed. He relaxed. It was subtle, but I saw it. The way his shoulders dropped when I didn't push back. The way his tone softened, just slightly, like he was easing out of a defensive posture. He thought he had regained control, which meant he started making mistakes. I let him talk more, watched him fill the silence he used to force onto me. He began to explain things without being asked, overconfident in his own narrative. "You don't need to stress about any of this," he told me one night over dinner, barely looking up from his phone. "I've already taken care of everything." Taken care of? The same words, the same tone. Only now, I understood what they meant. I nodded, like I always had. "Of course." He smiled. And that smile told me everything. A few weeks later, he filed for divorce. Not gradually, not after a long discussion. Suddenly, the papers arrived like a decision I hadn't been part of. Even though it was my life being divided on those pages, I read them carefully, line by line. My expression neutral even as the implications settled in. He wasn't just asking for separation. He was asking for everything. Full control of assets, financial authority, legal positioning that would leave me with almost nothing. And the timeline, it was aggressive. Hearing dates set close together. Motions already prepared. Language polished. Precise. This wasn't a reaction. It was execution. "He's moving fast," my attorney said when we met to go over the documents. "Faster than usual." "I know," I replied. She studied me for a moment. "Do you understand what he's trying to do?" "Yes," I said simply. What I didn't say was that I understood more than she did. Because she was seeing the legal strategy, I was seeing the pattern behind it. And I needed to let him believe it was working. That night, I sat at my desk. The files open in front of me, cross-referencing everything I had collected so far, and then something new appeared. At first, I thought it was just another alert, a routine notification. But when I opened it, I realized it wasn't. It was an email. No sender name. No identifying information. Just a subject line that didn't make sense until I opened the attachment. My breath caught for a second. Documents. Not ones I had seen before. Detailed. Structured. Organized in a way that suggested someone had been watching this longer than I had. I scrolled slowly, my mind racing as I absorbed what I was looking at. Transaction histories. Account connections. Names I didn't recognize but patterns I did. This went deeper than what I had uncovered. Much deeper. "Who sent this?" I whispered. More to myself than anyone else. There was no answer. No message. No explanation. Just information. And whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. This could be help, or it could be a trap. But either way, it changed everything. Because now, I wasn't just confirming what David had done. I was seeing how far it extended. I spent hours cross-referencing the new files with my own notes, connecting points, verifying timelines, building something solid enough to hold under pressure. And what emerged wasn't just a pattern. It was a system. Shell companies layered over each other. Transactions routed in ways designed to blur origin and ownership. Assets moved strategically before key dates. Before conversations. Before decisions. Before the divorce. This had been planned long before I realized the marriage was ending. A cold realization settled over me. I was never part of the plan, I said quietly. I was part of the setup. As if that wasn't enough, something else began to shift. The car I had noticed before, it was back. Closer this time. I saw it when I left the building, parked just far enough away to seem coincidental. I changed direction. It followed. Not aggressively. Not close enough to confront. Just present. A reminder. I tested it again the next day, taking a different route, making unexpected turns. Same result. My phone buzzed in my hand, and for a split second, the screen flickered before stabilizing. I stared at it, my grip tightening. They know, I murmured. Or at least, they suspected. And that meant I was running out of time. Fear crept in. Sharp and immediate. But it didn't stay. It couldn't. Because fear only mattered if it stopped you. And I wasn't stopping. I went back to my desk that night, locking everything behind me, shutting out the world until it was just me and the evidence. I needed something definitive. Something that tied everything together. Something that couldn't be explained away. Hours passed before I found it. A document buried deeper than anything else. Linked to a transaction that didn't just move money, but connected identities, dates, and intent in a way nothing else had. I stared at it. My pulse steady now. My thoughts clear. This is it, I said under my breath. The missing piece. The one that proved this wasn't just concealment. It was strategy. Deliberate. Calculated. And most importantly, provable. I printed it. Sealed it. Placed it in the envelope I now kept within reach at all times. Because I knew exactly where it needed to be revealed. Not here. Not now. In court. In front of a judge. Where it couldn't be dismissed. Where it would matter. I closed my laptop slowly. The weight of the moment settling in. All the pieces were in place. All the risks taken. All the silence maintained. Now, all that was left was to let him believe he had already won. Because the higher he climbed on that illusion, the harder he would fall. And by the time we stepped into that courtroom, the trap had already been set. The moment the envelope left my hand, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I stepped back into place slowly, my heels barely making a sound against the polished floor. The judge looked down at the envelope, then up at me, as if measuring whether this was something procedural or something that would change everything. It's evidence. Your Honor, I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. For a second, nothing moved. Then he reached for it. Across from me, David shifted slightly in his seat. Not much. Just enough for me to notice. His confidence hadn't disappeared. But something had interrupted it. A pause. A hesitation. He wasn't used to that. The judge opened the envelope carefully, sliding the documents out one at a time. The sound of paper brushing against paper felt louder than it should have. I watched his face, not the pages. His expression was neutral at first. Professional. Focused. Then it changed. Just slightly, a narrowing of the eyes. A longer pause between turning pages. A glance back at the first sheet. Like something wasn't lining up the way it should. David noticed it too. What is this? He said, leaning forward now, his tone controlled but sharper than before. The judge didn't answer immediately. He continued reading. flipping to the next document. I'm reviewing submitted evidence. Mr. Carter, he said evenly. David leaned back again, forcing a small smile. I'm sure whatever that is. It's been taken out of context. Of course he would say that. He always had an explanation ready. But explanations only work when the story still belongs to you. And this one didn't anymore. The judge reached the second set of documents, scanning them more carefully this time. These accounts, he said slowly, almost to himself. They were not disclosed in the initial filings. Silence. It spread across the room like something physical. David's jaw tightened. There are multiple structures involved, the judge continued, flipping another page. Transfers routed through intermediary entities. He stopped, looked up. Mr. Carter, would you like to explain these? David didn't answer right away. That was new. Instead, he glanced at his lawyer, who leaned in, whispering something urgent under her breath. They're business-related, David said finally, his tone measured. Completely legal. My company operates through multiple channels. That's not unusual. The judge didn't react to the explanation. He simply turned another page. I felt it then. The shift. Subtle, but undeniable. The room wasn't listening to David anymore. It was watching the evidence. That's just the surface, I thought quietly, because I knew what came next. The judge moved to the next section, his expression tightening just slightly as he read. These emails, he said, glancing down again. They appear to indicate coordination regarding the timing of asset movement. My eyes flicked, just for a second. Toward the second row, Lauren had gone completely still. Her posture, once relaxed, was now rigid, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Would you like to comment on this, Mr. Carter? The judge asked. David exhaled. Slower this time. Again. Context matters. Those communications are being misinterpreted. Are they? The judge replied calmly. Another pause. This one heavier. I could feel my lawyer straighten beside me, her earlier tension replaced with something sharper. Focused. The judge continued reading, his pace deliberate now. These transfers occurred within weeks of the divorce filing, he said, and the language used here suggests prior knowledge of that filing. David shifted again. This time, he didn't try to hide it. It was a business decision, he said. Timing is always strategic. Strategic. He had no idea how right he was. Because this entire moment was strategy. That wasn't even the worst part. I thought, my gaze steady on the judge. The courtroom felt different now. The quiet wasn't passive anymore. It was charged. People were leaning forward slightly, listening more carefully, watching for something they hadn't expected to find. The judge placed one document down and picked up another. This name appears multiple times, he said, his voice even but precise. Ms. Lauren Hayes. A ripple moved through the room. Small. Contained. But real. Lauren's head lifted slightly. Just enough to acknowledge that she had been pulled into the center of something she could no longer avoid. She's a colleague, David said quickly. Too quickly. There's nothing inappropriate about... These communications suggest involvement beyond professional interaction. The judge interrupted. David stopped. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because that was the first time he didn't have a clean response. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But certainty. The story was shifting. The judge continued reading, his expression now fully engaged. No longer neutral. I will need clarification on these transactions, he said finally, placing the documents together, as well as the extent of Miss Hayes' involvement. He looked up, directly at David. This is no longer a straightforward matter of asset division. The words landed with weight, real weight. David's composure didn't disappear, but it cracked. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers tapped once against the table before he forced them still. He leaned toward his lawyer again, whispering urgently now. For the first time since we walked into that room, he wasn't controlling the pace. He was reacting to it. I stood there, still, watching everything unfold exactly where it needed to. I hadn't won, I told myself quietly. Not yet. But he had already started losing. The judge adjusted the documents in front of him, glancing briefly toward the clerk before speaking again. "We will proceed," he said. "But additional testimony may be required." Additional testimony. I knew what that meant. And more importantly, so did David. He leaned back slowly, his eyes flicking across the room before landing on me for the first time since I had handed over the envelope, really looking at me, trying to read something he hadn't expected to see. But I didn't give him anything. No reaction, no expression. Just silence, because the moment he understood what was happening, it would already be too late. And just when he thought he could still fix it, I thought, watching the tension settle deeper into the room. The next move was already on its way. The clerk called the next name, and everything changed again. The moment the clerk called his name, the air in the room shifted. Matthew Carter. I didn't move, but David did. Just slightly, just enough for me to see it. His shoulders tightened, his jaw locking in a way I hadn't seen before, not even when the judge started questioning his accounts. This was different. More personal. More dangerous. Because this wasn't evidence. This was blood. Matthew stepped forward with quiet confidence, his expression composed, his posture straight. He looked exactly the way I remembered, controlled, precise, impossible to read. But there was something else now. Distance. He didn't look at David. Not once. And that, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. This was the moment, I thought, keeping my face still. The one he never saw coming. Matthew took the stand, raising his hand to be sworn in. His voice didn't waver. His tone didn't shift. If there was tension inside him, he didn't show it. "State your name and occupation for the record," the judge said. "Matthew Carter," he replied. "Attorney, licensed in the state of California." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Subtle, but unmistakable. David's younger brother. A lawyer. Testifying. I saw David glance at his attorney again. This time not for guidance, but for reassurance. He didn't get it. "Mr. Carter?" the judge continued. "You understand the nature of your testimony today." "I do, Your Honor. And you are choosing to testify voluntarily." "Yes." No hesitation. No qualifiers. Just certainty. I felt something shift inside me, not relief. Not yet, but alignment. Because everything I had built, everything I had prepared, was about to be reinforced from a place David could never control. Matthew sat back slightly, folding his hands together. I had professional involvement with certain financial and legal structures associated with Mr. Carter, he began. The wording was careful, deliberate, every word chosen for a reason. "What kind of involvement?" the judge asked. "I was asked to review and assist in structuring transactions," Matthew said. Across from me, David leaned forward. "Clarify that," he said quickly, his tone sharp. "You reviewed documents. That's all." Matthew didn't look at him. "I reviewed documents," he said calmly. "And I was asked to formalize certain arrangements." The distinction hung in the air, heavy. "Did you do so?" the judge asked. Matthew paused, just long enough for the weight of the answer to settle before he gave it. "No." Silence. Complete. David's hand tightened into a fist on the table. "Why not?" the judge continued. "Because the nature of those arrangements raised legal concerns," Matthew said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words carried themselves. "What kind of concerns?" the judge asked. Matthew exhaled slowly. "Concerns related to the intent behind the transactions," he said. "Specifically, whether they were designed to obscure ownership and shift liability." A murmur moved through the room. David's head snapped toward him. That's a mischaracterization, he said. Louder now. You're making assumptions based on incomplete information. Matthew remained still. I'm describing my professional assessment, he replied. Professional, not personal. That was important, because it removed emotion from the equation. Made this about facts, not family. Were you pressured to proceed with these arrangements? The judge asked. Matthew's eyes lowered for a brief moment. Not in hesitation. In acknowledgement. Yes, he said. The word landed harder than anything else so far. David let out a sharp breath. That's not, he started, but stopped himself, catching the judge's attention just in time. How were you pressured? The judge asked. Matthew's voice didn't change. I was encouraged to move forward despite my concerns, he said. And when I declined, there were consequences. What kind of consequences? Professional and personal, Matthew replied. I was told my refusal would impact our working relationship. And our family relationship? There it was. Not just manipulation. Control. Expanded beyond me. I felt it then. Fully. He didn't just try to control me, I thought. He tried to control everyone. David leaned forward again, his composure slipping. You're exaggerating, he said. We had a disagreement.
That's all.
Matthew finally looked at him. Just once. And in that look, there was no anger, no resentment, just distance. That's not how I remember it, he said quietly. The room stilled again. Because that wasn't just testimony. That was separation. Final. Irreversible. Do you have documentation to support your claims? The judge asked. Matthew nodded. Yes. Your Honor. He reached for the file he had brought with him, placing it carefully on the stand. These are records I retained, he said. Notes from meetings, copies of communications, and a timeline of the transactions I was asked to review. The judge took the file, flipping through the pages. I watched his expression again. The same pattern as before. Neutral. Focused. Then something else. Recognition. Because this wasn't new information. It was confirmation. Everything I had presented, now supported, strengthened, made undeniable. This aligns with previously submitted evidence, the judge said slowly. Matthew nodded once. Yes. I felt something settle inside me. Not victory. Not yet. But stability, because now, this wasn't just my narrative. It was a pattern, a structure, a truth that didn't rely on me alone. David shifted again. His movements sharper now, less controlled. You're taking things out of context, he said. You don't have the full picture. Matthew didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because the moment had already passed. The room had already seen what it needed to see. The judge closed the file, placing it beside the envelope. I will take this into consideration, he said. And just like that, the weight in the room changed again. David leaned back slowly. But there was no confidence left in the movement. Only tension. Only reaction. I stood there, still, watching it unfold. This is where it breaks, I thought quietly. Not loudly. Not all at once. But from the inside. And just when I thought I had seen the full extent of what he had done, I realized something else. There was still more. Because the truth we had uncovered so far was only part of the story. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. As Matthew stepped down from the stand, the room didn't relax. It tightened. The kind of tension that doesn't come from uncertainty, but from realizing the truth is bigger than anyone expected. The judge didn't speak right away. He sat there, looking down at the documents in front of him. The envelope I had handed over. Matthew's file. The fragments of a story that were now starting to connect. And then he looked up. Before we proceed, he said. His voice measured. I need clarification on several points. The way he said it wasn't procedural. It was investigative. I felt it immediately. This isn't over, I thought.
It's expanding.
My lawyer leaned slightly closer to me, her voice barely audible. He's digging deeper. I know, I replied, because I had seen where this could go, and I had been waiting for it. The judge flipped back through the documents, his attention narrowing on specific pages. These transactions, he said, tapping lightly against the file, are not only undisclosed, they appear structured in a way that raises questions beyond asset concealment. David didn't move. Not yet. What kind of questions? His attorney asked carefully. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for another document, one that hadn't been fully addressed yet. I recognized it instantly. My pulse slowed. Here, the judge said, holding it up slightly. This transaction is linked to an account that appears to have been accessed using credentials associated with Ms. Carter. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. I didn't react. Not externally. But inside, something sharpened. This is it. I thought. The part he thought would save him. My lawyer turned to me quickly, her voice low. Ashley, I know, I said, just as quietly, because I had seen that document before. I knew exactly what it looked like, and I knew exactly what it meant. Across from me, David finally leaned forward again. There it was, the confidence, not the careless kind he had before, the desperate kind. That's what I've been trying to explain, he said, his tone controlled but urgent. She had access. She was involved in the management of these accounts. Any irregularities? He stopped. Just for a second. But the damage was already done. He had said it. Out loud. He was trying to shift it. Onto me. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. The kind that comes when a narrative starts to fracture in multiple directions at once. The judge looked at me. Ms. Carter, he said. Can you explain your connection to this transaction? Every eye in the room turned toward me. This was the moment. The one he had been building toward. The one he thought would turn everything back in his favor. For a brief second, I let the silence sit. Let the weight of the question settle. Because this wasn't just about answering, it was about timing. Inside, I felt the echo of every moment that had led here. Every document I had reviewed. Every connection I had traced. Every decision I had made to stay silent when it would have been easier to react. He wants me to panic. I thought, to defend myself. But I didn't move. I didn't rush. I didn't give him what he expected. Instead, I took a slow breath and looked directly at the judge. Yes, I said calmly. I could feel David watching me now. Really watching me, trying to read something he hadn't seen before. But there was nothing there for him to read. Because I had already moved past this moment. This account, I continued, my voice steady, was accessed using credentials that were assigned to me during the early stages of our marriage. At that time, I had limited involvement in financial matters, as Mr. Carter was primarily responsible for managing them. I paused, just long enough to let the context settle. But I did not authorize the transaction in question. I added. David let out a short breath, almost a laugh. That's convenient, he said. You had access, but no responsibility. I didn't look at him. Not yet. Because this wasn't about him. Not anymore. This is the part he thinks will save him. I thought. But it's the part that ends him. The judge leaned slightly forward. Do you have evidence to support your claim? Ms. Carter? He asked. I met his gaze. Yes. Your Honor? I said. And I stopped there. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. I didn't reach for anything. Not yet. Because I could feel the tension building again. The uncertainty shifting. The room wasn't sure anymore. Not about him. Not about me. And that was exactly where I needed it to be. David's confidence flickered. Just for a second. But I saw it. Because he had expected me to fight. To react. To scramble for an explanation. Instead, I had done the one thing he couldn't control. I had waited. The judge sat back slightly. his expression unreadable. "This matter requires further clarification," he said. "We will proceed carefully." Carefully. That word mattered. Because it meant he wasn't dismissing anything. Not David's claim. Not my response. The tension didn't break. It deepened. And for the first time since this began, the outcome wasn't obvious. Not to anyone. David leaned back slowly, his jaw tight. His eyes fixed on me now in a way that felt different. Less certain. More calculating. He was trying to figure out what I was holding back. What I knew. What I was going to do next. And for the first time, he couldn't. I stood there, still, letting the moment settle, letting the weight of it expand. Because this wasn't the end of the truth. Not even close. This is where it gets dangerous. I thought, not for me. For him. The judge turned slightly, organizing the documents in front of him. "We will continue," he said. And as the room shifted once more, preparing for whatever came next, I knew something with absolute clarity. The story he had built was starting to collapse, and the one detail that would bring all of it down hadn't even been revealed yet. For the first time since the hearing began, the room wasn't watching me. It was watching him. I felt it in the way the silence shifted, no longer heavy with expectation, but sharp with attention. The kind that settles when people realize something isn't what it seemed. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly, his gaze moving between the documents on his desk and David. "Let's slow this down," he said. The tone had changed. Not neutral anymore. Not procedural. Deliberate. Controlled. And unmistakably serious. David's attorney straightened immediately. "Your Honor, we believe—" "I understand what you believe," the judge interrupted calmly. "But I need clarity. Not assumptions." The words landed clean. Precise. Final. I stood still, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space. For years, every conversation had been dictated by David's pace, his timing, his version of reality. Now, the system itself was taking that control away from him. My lawyer shifted beside me, her earlier tension replaced with focus. She leaned slightly toward me. "He's not rushing anymore," she whispered. "I know," I said quietly, because I could see what was happening. The faster David had tried to move this case forward, the more exposed he had become. And now the judge was pulling it apart, piece by piece. "Mr. Carter," the judge continued, flipping back to a previous document. "Earlier, you stated that all relevant accounts had been disclosed." David nodded once. "Yes. And yet," the judge said, tapping the page lightly, "these accounts were not included in your initial filing." David's jaw tightened. "They were part of ongoing business operations," he replied. "Not personal assets." The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned another page. "And the timing?" he asked. A pause. "Strategic," David said. "Standard practice." I almost smiled. Not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. He was still speaking like this was a negotiation. Like control was something he could reassert with the right phrasing. But the room wasn't responding to him the same way anymore. The weight of his words had changed, and he could feel it. I saw it in the way his fingers pressed harder against the table, the way his posture shifted, not relaxed anymore, but held together, maintained. The judge leaned back slightly. "Strategic," he repeated. Interesting choice of words. Silence followed. The kind that forces people to sit with what's been said. I let my eyes move. Just briefly. Across the room. That's when I noticed it. A man near the back, notebook in hand, watching closely. Not just observing, recording. A journalist. Of course. This was no longer contained. Not really. And David knew it. Because reputation was something he had always guarded carefully. More than money. More than anything. The idea that this could extend beyond the courtroom. That it could become public. That was pressure he hadn't planned for. Lauren shifted in her seat again. This time, it wasn't subtle. Her composure was cracking. The confidence she carried when she walked in, when she thought this was already decided, was gone. "Ms. Hayes," the judge said suddenly. Her head lifted. "Yes." "Your Honor, you've been referenced multiple times in the submitted evidence," he continued. "I'd like to clarify your role in these communications." Her fingers tightened together. I'm a colleague," she said. "We work together on certain projects. Projects involving financial coordination," the judge asked. Her hesitation was small, but it was there. "I wasn't responsible for those decisions," she said carefully. "Responsible. Not involved. Not aware. Responsible." The distinction mattered. And the judge noticed. "So you were aware of them," he said. Lauren didn't answer immediately. "Across from me." David shifted sharply. "She's not part of this," he said, his tone cutting through the tension. "Her name is being dragged into something she had no control over." Control? That word again. But this time, it sounded different, less certain, more defensive. I watched him closely. He was no longer guiding the conversation. He was reacting to it, trying to redirect it, trying to regain something that had already slipped. The judge didn't look at him. He kept his focus on Lauren. "Answer the question," he said. Lauren swallowed. "I was aware of some discussions," she admitted, "but I didn't understand the full context." The room shifted again. Because partial awareness is still awareness. And in a case like this, that mattered. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But confirmation. She was never prepared for this. I thought she was prepared for control, not exposure. David leaned forward again, his voice sharper now. "This is being taken out of proportion," he said. "You're building a narrative that doesn't exist." The judge finally looked at him, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression. Not neutrality. Scrutiny. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone firm. "The narrative is being built from your own documentation." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They stayed exactly where they landed. David didn't respond. Because there was nothing to respond with. Not anymore. I stood there, still, letting the moment unfold. Letting the system do what it was designed to do. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting to be heard. I was being understood. The judge turned back to the documents, organizing them with deliberate care. "These matters require further review," he said. "We are no longer dealing with a simple division of assets." There it was, spoken, out loud. A shift from routine to something else entirely. Something heavier. Something that carried consequences beyond this room. I felt my breath steady. Not because it was over, but because it was moving exactly where it needed to go. David sat back slowly, his gaze fixed ahead. But I could see it now. The tension, the calculation, the uncertainty. For the first time since this began, he didn't know what was coming next, and that was the one position he had never learned how to control. The judge paused, his hand resting lightly against the file. "There is one question," he said, looking up again. The room stilled. Completely. Because everyone felt it. This wasn't just another question. This was a turning point. "Mr. Carter," the judge continued, "can you explain why these transactions were structured in a way that places legal responsibility on Mrs. Carter's credentials, while the assets themselves remain outside her control?" Silence. Pure, unavoidable. I didn't move. Didn't breathe any differently. But inside, I knew. There's no answer to that. I thought. Not one that saves him. David opened his mouth, closed it, looked toward his attorney. And for the first time, he had nothing. The room didn't react. Not yet. But the shift was complete. Because now, it wasn't about what I could prove, or what he could deny. It was about what couldn't be explained. And as the silence stretched just a little too long, I realized something with absolute certainty. The system had turned, and he felt it. There was no answer he could give, not one that didn't unravel everything. The silence stretched just a second too long. And in a courtroom, that's all it takes for the truth to start showing itself. The judge didn't repeat the question. He didn't need to. Everyone had heard it. Everyone was waiting. David shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening against the table as he finally forced himself to speak. "It's a technical structure," he said, his voice steady at first. "Certain accounts require layered access for operational flexibility. That doesn't imply intent." Intent. He was still trying to frame it as complexity, not deception. The judge didn't react immediately. He glanced down at the documents again, then back up. "And yet," he said, "the structure places Ms. Carter's credentials at the point of liability without granting her access to the assets themselves." David exhaled slowly, like he was recalculating in real time. "That's a matter of internal management," he replied. "It's not uncommon." I could feel the tension beside me shift as my lawyer leaned forward, ready to speak. But I didn't move. I didn't need to, because this wasn't about arguments anymore. It was about contradictions. And they were starting to stack. The judge turned another page, his expression tightening just slightly. "Your brother's testimony suggests you were aware of these concerns," he said. "That you were advised against proceeding in this manner." David's jaw flexed. "We disagreed," he said. "That's all." Matthew didn't look at him, didn't react. He just sat there, still and composed, like the outcome no longer depended on him. The judge looked between them for a moment, then returned to the file. "And the communications with Ms. Hayes," he continued, his tone sharpening, "indicate coordination regarding the timing of these transactions in relation to the divorce filing." Lauren shifted beside the wall, her composure slipping further now. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the wood paneling behind her. "That's not what those emails mean," David said quickly. "Then explain them." The judge replied. Another pause. Longer this time. David opened his mouth, closed it, then glanced at his attorney again. She leaned in, whispering something urgent, but I could see it in her face. Even she wasn't certain how to frame this anymore. "They were discussions," David said finally. "Preliminary. Hypothetical. Hypothetical asset transfers," the judge asked. David's voice tightened. "Strategic planning." There it was again. "Strategy." But this time, it sounded thinner, less convincing. Because now, it wasn't just a word. It was a pattern. I watched him carefully. The way his posture had changed. The way his confidence had narrowed into something more fragile. He's not controlling this anymore, I thought. He's trying to contain it. Lauren was called again. She stepped forward slowly, her movements no longer composed but measured, like she was trying not to make a mistake. "Ms. Hayes," the judge said, "you stated earlier that you were aware of certain discussions but did not understand their full context." "Yes," she said quietly. "Can you clarify your role in these communications?" She hesitated, just for a moment, and that moment was enough. "I was included in some emails," she said, "but I didn't make decisions." "Were you aware that these transactions were being structured prior to the divorce filing?" the judge asked. Her eyes flicked, just briefly, toward David, and that was the answer. Even before she spoke, "I knew there were discussions," she said. "I didn't know the details. Partial truth. Enough to protect herself. Not enough to protect him." I felt something settle inside me. She's choosing herself now, I thought. She has to. David leaned forward sharply. "This is being twisted," he said, his voice louder now. "You're taking fragments and building a narrative that doesn't exist." The judge didn't look at him. He kept his focus on the documents. "The narrative," he said calmly, "is built from your own records." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed exactly where they needed to. David's composure cracked. Not completely. But visibly, his hand came down against the table. Not hard, but enough to break the stillness. "You're misinterpreting the structure," he said, his tone sharper, less controlled. "There's no intent to deceive." The judge finally looked at him again, and this time, there was no neutrality left. "Intent is determined by pattern," he said. "And the pattern here is concerning," that word, concerning, measured, deliberate, and devastating. Because it didn't accuse, it didn't exaggerate. It simply acknowledged. The courtroom shifted fully then. You could feel it. The way people leaned forward. The way attention locked into place. The way uncertainty gave way to something clearer. David wasn't the one leading anymore. He was the one being examined. My lawyer stepped forward then, her voice steady. "Your Honor," she said, "we believe the evidence demonstrates a consistent effort to conceal assets and shift liability in anticipation of this proceeding." The judge nodded once. "I agree that the matter requires serious consideration." Serious. Another word that carried weight. David sat back slowly, his gaze fixed ahead. But the tension in his body was unmistakable now. He wasn't calculating anymore. He was reacting. And that was where he was weakest. The judge gathered the documents together, aligning them carefully before speaking again. "Based on the evidence presented," he said, "the court finds that Mr. Carter's claim to full asset control is unsupported." The words hit the room like a shift in gravity. Furthermore, the judge continued, "There is sufficient cause to review the financial activity in question for potential misconduct." Misconduct. Not suspicion. Not concern. Something more defined. Something with consequences. Lauren lowered her head. David didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't react. Because there was nothing left to say. I stood there. Still, feeling the moment settle around me. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just clarity. I didn't need to destroy him. I thought he did that himself. The courtroom remained quiet, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. And as I watched him sit there, the man who had once controlled every part of my life, I realized something. This wasn't the end of what he was losing. It was just the beginning. Everyone thought it was over. You could feel it in the way people started to move. The subtle release of tension as papers were gathered and chairs shifted quietly across the courtroom floor. The decision had been made. The structure David built had collapsed in front of everyone. For most people, that would have been the end. But I knew better. Because David had never been the kind of man to walk away quietly. I saw it before anyone else did. The way his shoulders straightened again. The way his gaze sharpened. Not outward, but inward. Like he was reaching for something he hadn't used yet. A final move. "Your Honor," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the room before it could fully settle. Everything stilled again. The judge looked up. "Yes. Mr. Carter." David stood slowly, adjusting his jacket like he was stepping into control again, even if only for a moment. "There's something that hasn't been addressed," he said. "Something that directly involves Ms. Carter." My lawyer turned to me immediately, her voice low. "What is he doing?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. He's not done, I thought. And this is what he's been holding back. David's eyes found mine. And this time, he didn't look uncertain. He looked certain again. For all the discussion about these transactions, he continued, "There's one critical detail missing." The judge watched him carefully. "Go on." David exhaled slowly, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Ms. Carter had access to the accounts in question," he said. "Her credentials were used. Her authorization appears in multiple records." A murmur moved through the room again. Small, but sharp. My lawyer stepped forward. "Your Honor, we..." The judge raised a hand slightly, stopping her. "I'd like to hear this," he said. Of course he did. Because on the surface, it made sense. If my name was attached, if my credentials were used, then I wasn't just a victim. I was part of it. David turned slightly, addressing the room now. Not just the judge. She's presenting herself as someone who was manipulated. Controlled, he said. But the records show she had direct involvement, that she knew what was happening. His tone was steady, carefully measured. This was the version of him that won negotiations, that convinced people, that built narratives and made them feel real. For a brief second, I could feel the weight of it pressing against the room. The possibility, the doubt, that's his last move. I thought, turn it back on me. My lawyer leaned in again, her voice urgent. Ashley, we need to respond now. Not yet, I said quietly. Because this wasn't the moment to react. It was the moment to end it. The judge turned his attention back to me. Ms. Carter, he said. This is a serious claim. Can you address it? Every eye in the room shifted again. Back to me. Waiting. Expecting. For the first time since this began, uncertainty wasn't just on his side. It was everywhere. I took a slow breath, let it out, and then I stepped forward. Yes, I said calmly. I didn't rush. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't try to overpower him. Because I didn't need to. You're right, I continued, looking directly at David now. My credentials were used. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. There it was. The moment he thought he had pulled it back. But I didn't stop. They were assigned to me early in our marriage, I said, turning back to the judge. At a time when I still had access to certain systems. I paused, just long enough. But access isn't the same as control. The room held still again. David's expression didn't change. Not yet. Over time, I continued. That access was restricted. Gradually. Quietly. Without my full knowledge, I could feel the shift starting again. Small, but real. And while my credentials remained attached to certain structures, I said, my voice steady, the decisions, the execution, and the movement of those assets were not mine. David let out a short breath, almost a laugh. That's convenient, he said. You're saying your name was used. Your access existed, but you had no involvement. I met his gaze. For the first time, fully. Yes, I said. And then I reached for the final piece. The one I had been holding back. Because I knew this would be your argument. I added quietly. The words landed differently this time. Not defensive. Predictive. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I said. There's one more document I'd like you to review. My lawyer blinked beside me. Surprised. You didn't tell me, she started. I know, I said softly. Because I couldn't. Not until now. I reached into my folder and pulled out the final page. The one I had found late that night. The one that connected everything. The one that proved this wasn't just concealment. It was a setup. I handed it forward. The judge took it carefully, his expression unreadable as he began to read. The room didn't move. Didn't breathe. Didn't exist outside of that moment. I watched David. Really watched him. Because this time, he wasn't smiling. He wasn't confident. He wasn't calculating. He was waiting. And for the first time, he didn't know what was coming. The judge's eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped, went back, read it again. And in that moment, I saw it. Recognition. Understanding. Finality. He looked up. Not at me. At David. And everything changed. There is clear indication here, the judge said slowly, that these credentials were used in a manner inconsistent with direct authorization. The words were precise, measured, but devastating. David didn't speak. Couldn't. Because the narrative he had just tried to build had already collapsed. There's also evidence, the judge continued, suggesting an intentional structuring of liability. Intentional. That word mattered. Because it ended everything. I stepped back. My hands steady. My breathing even. I didn't destroy him, I thought quietly. I just showed the truth at the right time. The room settled again. But this time, it wasn't uncertainty. It was resolution. And as I stood there, watching the final piece fall into place, I realized something. He hadn't just lost the case. He had lost control of the story. Completely. The doors closed behind me. And just like that, it was quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels empty. The kind that feels earned. For a moment, I just stood there on the courthouse steps, letting the noise from inside fade into something distant. Something that no longer belonged to me. People moved around me, lawyers, reporters, strangers, but none of it reached me the way it would have before. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. A voice called my name somewhere to my left. Cameras shifted. Questions started forming before they were even spoken. Ms. Carter, Ashley, do you have a statement? I didn't turn. Not immediately. There was a time when I would have felt the need to explain, to defend, to make sure the story being told about me was the right one. But not anymore. I don't owe anyone a version of this, I thought. Not yet. I walked past them instead, the sunlight catching in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like stepping into something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Freedom didn't feel loud. It felt steady. The car ride home was quiet. No calls. No messages. No interruptions. Just space. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the stillness hit me all at once. It was the same place. The same walls. The same furniture. But it didn't feel the same. Because he wasn't there. No tension in the air. No unspoken expectations. No careful adjustments to keep the peace. Just silence. I set my bag down slowly, letting my fingers rest against the table for a second longer than necessary. This is mine, I thought. Not the house. The moment. The space. The life. For the first time, it wasn't something I was navigating around someone else. It was something I could actually stand inside. Later that evening, I sat at my desk again, the same one where everything had started to unravel. The laptop in front of me flickered to life. The familiar folders still there, unfinished drafts, archived notes, fragments of stories I had once thought mattered more than anything. I opened one, then another, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel disconnected from them. I felt like I understood them, not just as stories, as patterns, as truths people don't always see until it's too late. I wasn't just writing about other people anymore. I realized I had lived it. The thought didn't feel heavy. It felt clarifying. My phone buzzed softly beside me. I glanced at the screen. A notification. A news alert. His name. I didn't open it. I didn't need to, because I already knew what it would say. Investigation. Financial misconduct. Possible charges. Words that would have once felt like justice. Now, they just felt expected. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment settle. I don't need to watch him fall. I thought, it's already happening. Lauren's name appeared next. Another headline. Another shift. Career impact. Credibility questioned. Consequences. I exhaled slowly. Not out of relief, but out of understanding. She made her choices, just like he did. And now, the outcome belonged to them, not to me. That was the difference. For so long, I had been pulled into their decisions, their control, their version of reality. Now, I was separate, untouched by it. I stood up, walking slowly through the room, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the light moved across the floor, the quiet hum of the city outside, the absence of tension where it used to live. It wasn't loneliness, I thought. It was space. And space meant possibility. I stopped by the window, resting my hand lightly against the glass. For years, I had been living inside something I didn't fully understand. A system of control that disguised itself as stability. A version of love that slowly erased pieces of me until I didn't recognize what was left. But now I could see it clearly. It wasn't that I was weak, I said softly. I was being controlled. And the moment I stopped accepting that control, everything changed. I went back to the desk, opening a new document. The cursor blinked at me, waiting. For the first time, I didn't hesitate. I started typing, not about him, not about the case, about something deeper, about how easily control can hide in plain sight, how people can lose themselves without realizing it, how silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. I paused, reading over the words, feeling something settle into place. I'm not just rebuilding. I thought, I'm redefining. The past wasn't gone, but it wasn't holding me anymore. I closed the laptop gently, standing there for a moment, letting everything sink in. This wasn't the end of something. Not really. It was the end of who I used to be inside that life, and the beginning of something else, something quieter, stronger, real. I walked toward the door, picking up my keys. The motion simple but meaningful, because I wasn't leaving something behind anymore. I was moving forward. And as I stepped outside again, into a world that finally felt like it belonged to me, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was the first chapter I was finally writing for myself. The morning felt different. Not brighter. Not louder. Just clearer. I stood by the window with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the city move the way it always had, cars passing, people walking, lives unfolding in quiet, ordinary ways. But for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to fit myself into that movement. I was just there, present. It took me a while to understand that peace doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It settles slowly, in the spaces where chaos used to live. And for me, that space had been filled for a long time. With control, with doubt, with the constant feeling that I had to adjust, explain, prove something just to exist inside my own life. Now, there was none of that. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth ground me. For the first time, I thought, this is mine. Not the apartment, not the career, not even the outcome of the case. This moment, the ability to stand still without feeling like I needed permission to do it. I set the cup down and walked back to my desk, opening my laptop without hesitation. The screen lit up, familiar and steady, waiting. No pressure, no expectations, just possibility. I pulled up a new draft and started reading through what I had written the night before. The words felt different now, not like something I was trying to figure out, but something I already understood. Stories about manipulation, about quiet control, about people who didn't realize they were losing themselves until there was almost nothing left. I used to think I was writing about other people. Now I knew better. I had lived it. And that changed everything. I leaned back in my chair, letting the thought settle. David's name crossed my mind for a second, the way it sometimes does when something ends but hasn't fully disappeared yet. But there was no emotion attached to it. No anger. No satisfaction. Just distance. Whatever was happening to him now, investigations. Consequences. The slow unraveling of everything he built. It wasn't mine to carry anymore. And that was the part I never expected. The freedom didn't come from watching him fall. It came from not needing to. Lauren, too. Her choices. Her consequences. They belonged to her. And that clarity, it felt lighter than anything else. I stood up again, walking slowly across the room, letting my hand brush against the edge of the table as I passed. Small movements, simple actions, but they felt intentional. Like every step I took now was something I chose. I stopped in front of the mirror, not out of habit, but curiosity. For a long time, I had avoided looking too closely, not because I didn't recognize myself, but because I didn't fully understand who I was anymore. Now, I did. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. They underestimated me, I said quietly, almost to my reflection. And for a second, I smiled. Not because of what happened in that courtroom, but because of everything that led to it. The silence, the patience, the decision not to react when reacting would have been easier. That was the part people don't see. They see the moment everything falls apart. They don't see the moments where you choose to stay still, to watch, to understand, to prepare. I turned away from the mirror, walking toward the door again, the same way I had the day before. But this time, it felt different. Not like an ending, like a beginning. Because everything David thought he was taking from me was never really his to take. Not my voice, not my clarity, not my ability to see the truth when it mattered. I reached for the handle, pausing just for a second. Because there was one more thing I understood now. Sometimes, the moment someone thinks they've taken everything from you is the moment you finally see what was yours all along. And if you've ever been in a situation like that, where someone tried to control your life, your choices, or even your sense of who you are, I want to know, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him earlier, or waited like I did? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you've been through, or something you're still trying to understand, stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories about truth, about power, about the quiet ways people lose themselves and how they find their way back. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is wait, and then take everything back on your own terms. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.